So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So the presentation we'll talk about today is called Implementing Mother Tongue Instruction in the Real World as Results from Medium-Scale Randomized Controlled Trial in Kenya. And I want to just welcome anybody who's on the call from Kenya or were involved in the project at any stage, and just appreciate all of you for the contribution to the study. And I think I'm excited about the opportunity to share it. So first of all, thanks to the hosts for making this webinar possible, as well as to DFID for funding it, because without donors like them, we wouldn't be able to do this sort of work. So I'm actually in a slightly different position now. I am working as the Senior Director for African Education for RTI, based here in Nairobi, and have looking for more opportunities to share research like this. This particular study from 2013 to 2014, and it was really organized and structured to help us investigate whether or not the sort of mother tongue instructional projects that many of us have in mind in the countries we care about or know, whether or not those would work in the complex language environments at medium scale. The basic question really is not does it work in small controlled environments, but if a country is going to consider taking a mother tongue policy to large scale, there really is a dearth of research in the sector. My co-author, Stephanie Zolkowski, I think she's on the call. Hi, Stephanie. She did quite a bit of research along with some partners to look at what evidence there is in the area that is at medium scale, and there's quite a dearth of research on this topic at medium scale. So in this large scale, medium scale environment, what does it look like to implement mother tongue instruction? To walk you through what we're going to talk about, we're going to kind of give you the lay of the land of the design. We'll look at the research findings that were recently published in a comparative education review article, and then some new research findings that we have under submission with another journal on the impact of mother tongue on other subjects. So in Kenya is a pretty complex language environment. They've had a mother tongue policy for the last almost 40 years, and the policy officially is the language of the catchment area is the language of instruction from pre-K to grade 3. There's been heavy resistance to that policy for the last several decades, and in fact, research from a variety of Kenyan authors have shown that policy, mother tongue instruction, is used quite little, and particularly as a language of instruction, that it's almost used none at all, and that even that the mother tongue time on the timetable is often used for an additional math lesson or English lesson. And where it does exist, it's limited to some rural areas. Some places actually it has been shown to decrease enrollment, where you have a English medium alternative school, either in a low-cost private school or private school. There has been some flight from schools that are using mother tongue to these other schools. So it's really a contentious, complicated country with respect to language of instruction, though the policy has remained the same. So we are testing out here in Kenya in two relatively homogeneous locations whether or not you can implement a mother tongue project at scale. And the two locations are Bungoma on the western part of Kenya and Machakos on just to the east of Nairobi, what was the first capital of Kenya. And they're relatively homogeneous, but not entirely, as I know is the case in the countries you know. So this is not the first time that Kenya and Kenyans have looked at language of instruction in Kenya. There was actually a study that we worked on with the ministry in 2011, which used a modified Starling snapshot to understand the actual languages used across several hundred classroom observations and several thousand snapshots of classroom time. And we find here the y-axis is the percentage of classroom time, and the various things on the x-axis are the different subjects. English, Kiswahili, and mother tongue in blue, red, and green, respectively, are the percentage of time in that subject that this language is being used. So we found that English is 90% taught in English. Mother tongue language environment, you'd expect the social studies, maths, life skills, etc., would also be taught would not be taught in English, but in mother tongue or Kiswahili, depending on the location. And we find instead that social studies 80+% is in English, maths is nearly 80%, life skills is 75%. CRE stands for Christian Religious Education, 72%, science, similar pattern. Kiswahili, on the other hand, is predominantly taught in Kiswahili, 91% in Kiswahili, and mother tongue similarly taught in mother tongue. So if you didn't know that the language of policy in Kenya was mother tongue, you would assume from this data that it was an English language policy in practice. And this is kind of made more complicated as you look at the same set of data, but instead of looking at it by subject, we look at it by grade. The policy is from grade 1 to 3, instruction would be in mother tongue. And in fact, we find even in grade 1, only 25% of instruction is in mother tongue. That decreases to grade 2 by almost 50%, with English increasing. Class 3, there's 10% of mother tongue used. Class 4 and Class 5, it's basically gone. So what you have in practice is that even from the beginning parts of primary school, Kenyans are being faced with an English language and instruction policy. That's the context that the government wanted to design this mother tongue research project. This is the key part of it. We really have structured it so that we're using random selection, random assignment, so that any zone in the county that is eligible could be selected for the study and then assigned to any of the treatment groups. And we're assigning at the zonal level so that the kind of structures inside of the government system are utilized for a mother tongue project. You're not just implementing mother tongue in one selected school, but utilizing the instructional support systems inside of the country and treating all the schools the same. The project was medium scale, 171 schools across these two languages. Is kind of a typical EGRA measure. And for those of you who don't care about stats, close your ears for the next 20 seconds. But the results are using weighted data with cluster standard errors, accounting for the nesting of kids in schools and zones. And we utilized differences in differences analysis, though just looking at the Endline result, but comparing by treatment group, basically had the same results. So appreciation to SIL and their talented language experts who worked on this. They developed, alongside of the ministry and our team, the materials for these two languages. We piloted 71 schools. I think the key thing from this slide is at the bottom is that we are trying to test not only whether it will work at medium scale, but also whether it would work with pretty minimal cost investment. So we only did 2 days of additional mother tongue training because we wanted to see if this could be part of a broader English Kiswahili math as well as mother tongue. This is kind of the next slide is a key one for us, is that we wanted to differentiate this study from kind of the context of studies that have come before. Most of the mother tongue evaluations from sub-Saharan Africa, now I know there's many from other parts of the world, but from sub-Saharan Africa have been pretty small in size, and this one is at least a medium scale. Both of typical mother tongue evaluation and this one have had a control comparison, so you're not just saying that at point A we had one result and point B it's higher. You're also comparing whether or not there's a change in the control condition. But here's a really important point, I think, is that the study was structured so that you're not just comparing the mother tongue intervention against control, but you're comparing it to the policy alternative that a country has, which is a non-mother tongue program. So many countries right now are debating between whether or not to go to a mother tongue intervention or a non-mother tongue intervention that would kind of use one kind of more widely shared language. And so in this study, we wanted to compare them systematically so you're not just saying from a theoretical point of view what the results would be. So sampling was very random as opposed to some of the more purposeful sampling that would kind of limit to where the language environment is most homogeneous, but you kind of get what you get, and some zones, as you find out, didn't really want to be in the study or didn't have the language experts they were supposed to. And then similarly, that idea of language environment. So if a mother tongue program is going to work at large scale, we as researchers need to have an idea of how communities resist. What are their complaints? How can those complaints about mother tongue instruction be responded to by the projects? And so we wanted to actually have that be part of this design systematically rather than organize it in kind of the perfect language environment. And similarly, if the participants weren't fluent in the mother tongue or weren't from that ethnic group in this study, we just took the environment, whatever was randomly assigned to whichever treatment, and we just looked at what happened rather than kind of organizing it to make sure that it's the right location. And then per pupil cost. I know that countries that are making decisions between mother tongue and non-mother tongue really do have to consider cost. And so instead of having a heavy investment, we wanted to test whether kind of a pretty modest amount of training, a pretty modest amount of additional costs and books could have an effect. So again, now we're comparing the PRIMR non-mother tongue intervention and the PRIMR with mother tongue intervention. And both groups are quite similar. They're treated exactly the same. Everybody had learning materials at 1-to-1. The difference here in red is that the mother tongue program also got mother tongue materials. The support for the TAC tutors are the instructional supervisors who are given by the government 15 to 20 schools to support. That system was the same. They had the same number of days of training, the same support entirely. The TAC tutors for both groups had tablets and tools on there to give feedback to teachers. They had the same number of days of training except for this additional 2 days for mother tongue. And you're giving assessments. This is key. You're giving assessments to both treatment groups, both the non-mother tongue one and the mother tongue one. You're assessing both sets of kids on mother tongue to see what the results are. Just a bit more background. There's some learning materials that were invested and again supported by SIL, the Pupils Book, the Teacher's Guide, which was organized very closely to how the Teacher's Guide in English and Kiswahili looked. there was a big book and then a set of supplementary readers, which were quite nice. TAC tutors had support, and then your teachers had both the training, then observations on a monthly basis or almost monthly basis, and then reflection sessions at their zonal level. So, the sort of materials we had kind of a balanced approach to having some phonics instruction, letter level, syllable level, word level. There's additional pages aren't shown here, but they had stories every single day, and every other day they had stories that are orally read. Those stories had comprehension questions, pre-reading activities, post-reading activities, as well as writing. So it was the sort of thing that I was really proud to be able to see implemented in the classroom. Now, here's a key point. I want you to have an idea of how the research design was structured. We had very similar intervention components for the two interventions. Both of them had teacher's guides, lesson plans. Both of them had pupil books. Both of them had the same amount of training and support, except for this additional 2 days. The PRIMR plus Mother Tongue treatment group, bottom row, had English, Kiswahili, and math. So both groups also had English, Kiswahili, and math. It's only the PRIMR and Mother Tongue group that also had Mother Tongue. So with this sort of design, you're able to just test what is the marginal additional effect of just adding Mother Tongue to an instructional program that has this broader set of instructional components. And we'll talk about that, why that's important as we go on. Now, this slide is really important, the challenges to the implementation in Mother Tongue. So those of you who've worked on developing language materials, one of the languages in Kenya had a pretty complex set of choices to be made around orthography decisions. So that one had some people who liked the choices that we made and some that didn't. And I think that's an important one. Those of you who are developing materials have already felt or are feeling now is that those choices you're making, with language experts aren't always agreed upon when you get to the field. For the most part, the materials were well received, but that was one challenge that came up. One of the TAC tutors in each group didn't speak the mother tongue at all. They weren't from that language group, even though they were assigned to implement it. And I just want to reiterate, I think it's really important to understand what happens in that kind of scenario is, what accommodations do they make? Do they kind of give up on the project? We purposely said, well, look, let's just see what happens. I know you're not a Lubukusu speaker, but let's find out what happens. And some teachers didn't speak the local language. I was in a couple classrooms with teachers in both language groups who were teaching the lessons but were not speakers of that language. And so it's a very important part of the research to find out how they accommodate it, how they respond. There was a decent percentage of those. We had evidence that there were several community meetings that complained about having the mother tongue. There were some quotes about parents complaining that we don't want mother tongue, we give us English or Chinese, but we don't want this mother tongue. We teach them that at home. We were able to kind of respond to those and encourage them to stick with the program. We actually had one zone formally asked to be removed from the mother tongue program. We said, you don't have to implement the project if you don't want to, but we're not going to remove you. We'll keep giving you the same support. At the end of the day, that zone, set of 15 schools, implemented relatively well. But in general, there was much more limited enthusiasm for the mother tongue portion of the project compared to the other subjects. And I think that's important to note, is that we had at least one interviewee tell us that we would really have complained, but we wasn't an either or. We were getting mother tongue on top of these other subjects. So we wished we didn't have it, but we didn't complain that much. And the limited enthusiasm also showed itself in some of the observations that the TAC tutors made, these instructional supervisors. We found that they were more likely to observe an English or a math lesson than a mother tongue one. With all that said, all those challenges that I know might reflect the scenarios and situations in the countries you work, the real question is, did the program have an effect on learning outcomes? And so this table gives you the comparisons at the Endline between the treatment and control groups. Subtasks are there on the left. The treatment and control for Lubukusu is in the middle, and Kikamba is on the right. And without going into all the details, you basically see that the treatment, if you look on the right for Kikamba, is half again as high as control or twice as high as control for all the areas, and that's true for Lubukusu. So basically all these were statistically significant, but some of them had different levels of magnitude. The red boxes show you where the treatment is versus the control. To put it another way, we wanted both to know whether there was effects, but how those effects differed by languages. So Kikamba was a language that has diacritics on the vowels, and that really was a struggle for some kids who are used to Kiswahili, which is also a Bantu language but doesn't have the diacritics. Lubukusu was a similar language but had this kind of complexity with language, particularly in orthography choices. What you find here is that the y-axis is kind of the effects, either letter fluency or percentage correct. These are causal effects. So these bars are the additional impact of the primer mother tongue program over and above control. So when it says 19.6 in black, that means for Kikamba, on letter sound fluency, the additional causal effect that you could say was as a result of the mother tongue program was an additional 20 letters a minute. So we found statistically significant effects for almost all of the measures. Non-word fluency, some of those weren't statistically significant. If you look on the right, the reading comprehension effect for Kikamba was 18% and just 4% for Lubukusu, though it was statistically significant at the 0.1 level. There were slightly larger effects for Kikamba on letter sounds and reading comprehension, but the basic story is that we saw pretty encouraging effects for both languages compared to the control. Now, let's look at the more complicated question, which is how does the primer mother tongue program, where they were taught in Kikamba or Lubukusu, compare to the non-mother tongue program in similar areas in those two language environments? So these black bars are the additional causal gains on learning outcomes for kids who are in the non-mother tongue program. So they're only learning in English and Kiswahili, and I didn't get any mother tongue. Were they able to transfer those skills using kind of the bidirectional theory of language transfer? Were they able to transfer those skills from a language they were taught in to a language they weren't taught in? And we find that for letter sounds, you see statistically significant effects. Syllable fluency, non-word fluency wasn't statistically significant. Now contrast that to the mother tongue intervention, where you saw statistically significant effects for letter sounds, syllables. Non-word was also not statistically significant, but fluency and comprehension. So you find some effects for the non-mother tongue program, but statistically significant effects across the board for the primer and mother tongue intervention. I wish I could see your faces, because you should be excited if you care about mother tongue. That's encouraging. For Lubukusu, we found a similar pattern, except this weird effect for reading comprehension. It's negative for the primer program. I'm not sure what happened with that. Sometimes you just run too many regressions and get weird effects, or something negative happen. I don't know. But the basic idea is that similarly, you have some positive gains on Lubukusu for the primer in black. Those are the non-mother tongue treatment group. They did gain more than the control. They're statistically significant for a couple of these measures. But the only way that you saw these effects for reading fluency or comprehension, small as they were if they were in the primer and mother tongue group. The effect sizes on the next slide were not negligible for the primer only group. This again takes all of those results into kind of one effect size for class 1 and class 2. And you find decent effect sizes basically across the board except for class 2 Lubukusu. You do find higher effect sizes for the primer mother tongue treatment group in 3 of them, but we're seeing like a 0.2 something standard deviation effect for the primer non-mother tongue treatment group and nearly a 0.5 for the primer plus mother tongue. So we're seeing effects on both, but significantly higher in the primer mother tongue group. So here's the basic findings from this part of the study. There's significant and meaningful impacts on mother tongue literacy outcomes in this medium scale control trial, even with all the complexities. Okay, that is, I think, one of the things we're excited to see from the study is that there's some positive impact in a short period of time on mother tongue literacy, even in the complex language environment of Kenya. There is some additional impacts on mother tongue in this non-mother tongue treatment group, which we were interested to find. It seems that there's some transfer of decoding skills to mother tongue. However, to be able to understand mother tongue and read it fluently, you really do need instruction in mother tongue. You won't just get that from transfer across languages. So here's the headline. Basic point is that you're able to improve mother tongue results, even in complex learning environments, even with small investments and relatively short time periods. Now, that's exciting for us on the call who care about mother tongue, and exciting for the kids in the study. But for many of the policymakers, it's this key question. It's not just can they learn to read mother tongue, but does learning to read mother tongue result in a higher impact and a better outcomes in other subjects which are eventually examined in Kenya. Kenya is a heavily examined country, and what many community members want is to be able to have their kids pass the primary exam. So the question here is, was there an impact of being in this mother tongue treatment group on the other subjects of interest? So, same point. This is based in the real world. So Some of these language environments are perfect and some of them are not. The study was structured so that it was English, Kiswahili, and math. So both treatment groups had English, Kiswahili, and math in addition to mother tongue. We didn't develop any materials in mother tongue. That's the key point. But we did encourage and support teachers to use mother tongue to teach those subjects. So talking about the benefits of teaching mathematics in mother tongue. But we didn't force them to do so. We supported them, giving feedback from the TAC tutors in doing so, but it wasn't part of, we couldn't change that behavior like anything else. So here's the two questions were this. What was the impact of this mother tongue intervention, both on language use? We expect that if you're going to have any impact on learning outcomes in these other subjects, you would have to first have some additional time spent in mother tongue in those subjects. And then secondarily, if that was the case, there would then be some impact on those other subjects. What we found is this. This is the language use in Kiswahili and English. On the y-axis is the percentage of time, again, using these Starling snapshots, which is several hundred classrooms, I think 12,000 language observation snapshot. English is on the left, Kiswahili is on the right. These are the subjects, English and Kiswahili. And we wanted to know what's the percentage of time in the subject called English and in the subject called Kiswahili, what's the percentage of time that they use mother tongue? And we found for the control group, this is at the post-test, it was 7% of the time that they in English class they use mother tongue, and 1% of the time in the Kiswahili class they use mother tongue. This is for code switching, explaining a word or something else. In the PRIMR group, which didn't have any mother tongue investment, it was 2% and 1%. And most importantly for us is this white bar, the percentage of time that in the mother tongue treatment group they were using mother tongue. And what you found, surprisingly, is less than 2% of time in the intervention group in English and Kiswahili were they using mother tongue. So basically we didn't change teacher behavior much at all in those two subjects. Now, mathematics maybe had a better chance of this because mathematics is a subject that you can choose. It's easier to use a mother tongue than it maybe is in the subject called English. What we have here are English on the left side, mother tongue in the middle, and Kiswahili. So this is again language snapshot. Black in this case is baseline. Baseline before we started, just like in the previous study, 80% of the language of instruction in the mathematics class was in English. And the majority of the rest of the time was in Kiswahili. That's true across treatment groups. What we worked on to see is can we increase the percentage of time at the Endline where the mother tongue treatment group used mathematics in the class. And what we found is that there was an increase. If you look here in the middle, mother tongue language use, PRIMR plus mother tongue, went from 1% at baseline to 12% at Endline. We saw some increase there. Interestingly, the increase was almost the same as it was in control. We're not really clear why that happened, but we did see some change in the language use in the treatment group, but not much change otherwise. This one, I won't spend too much time on it, but basically it compares in the change in mother tongue, is it on what the language that the teachers use, the language that the students use, or the materials that were used. The control group increased, there was an increase in the percentage of time using mother tongue by the teacher, 12%, and the student, 9%. The PRIMR group had smaller changes and actually a negative change in the percentage of time using mother tongue in materials, which makes sense because they were given books by the project that were in English for math. And we saw some change by the teachers, a 10% increase by teachers in the percentage of time using mother tongue, and a 6% by students, but a reduction in the language use of materials, largely because of the materials they're getting from us. So what's the impact of mother tongue? Now we're getting to the key question. We want to see the impact on other subjects. Again, we assess kids in English, Kiswahili, and mathematics, and we are comparing the mother tongue treatment group against the non-mother tongue PRIMR treatment group on these other subjects. Okay? So what you'll see here in this table is on the left are all the things we measured them on for English, Kiswahili, and math, and then the column in the middle is the overall effect that's kind of combining grade 1 and 2. And then the grade 1 effect alone, the grade 2 effect alone. So if you look at the top, if it's blank, that means there was no statistically significant change. There's no difference between the mother tongue treatment group and the non-mother tongue treatment group. And it basically shows that for English, there's no difference. There's no effect. We didn't change learning outcomes at all in English, whether or not they're in the mother tongue treatment group or they're non-mother tongue. In Kiswahili, there was one effect which was negative, actually. Not a great explanation for that. What was interesting and surprising was a negative effect in 8 of the measures that we assessed for mathematics, where kids in the PRIMR mother tongue treatment group had actually lower outcomes than the kids in the non-mother tongue treatment group. Those negative effects are predominantly, focused on kind of the computational addition and subtraction. So maybe it's related to how they were helping the kids with teaching those kind of basic skills as opposed to the number sense ones, which had fewer negative effects. But we were surprised to see negative effects at all. Now, to be clear, these negative effects are compared to the the non-mother tongue primer group. The basic finding was the primer mother tongue group had the same mathematics results as control. So basically what happened is, being in the mother tongue treatment group, you basically lost the additional benefits of having been involved in primer non-mother tongue. So here's the finding summary. We had no effect on the language use in English or Kiswahili. There was no changes in how teachers use language. The primer mother tongue group modestly increased the mother tongue language use in math. There was no effect in English, basically no effect on Kiswahili, and then negative effect on mathematics outcomes, particularly addition and subtraction. As I said, I'd be interested to hear from you what are some of the plausible explanations for this, but it did seem that it was kind of a consistent finding across grades and for the overall study. I think what I was encouraged by from this study was that it was an opportunity to try and undertake this mother tongue research in real world conditions where we're really testing what happens when you're doing something different and how the teachers and students and parents and communities behave in these interventions. We would like to, in the future studies, be able to analyze mother tongue impacts over a longer period. We weren't able to get funding to extend it. And I would just say that using small controlled studies as evidence for large-scale mother tongue projects might be relatively misguided, because what you really want to be able to predict are what are the likely community and school and teacher responses to a program or a design. And if you have such a small controlled study where you don't get to experience that, you really lose out on some of the kind of lessons learned that would be necessary to implement at large scale. We also really suggest that we consider local language demand. So there really is value to understanding what communities want and why they want it, and designing projects in response to that. And I think that this kind of real-world implementation results should inform best practice. I've been an adherent and proponent of mother tongues for quite a while, but we keep referencing the same non-African studies at large scale without having kind of some of the research from this part of the world or other similar developing countries that might be more relevant to understanding the complexities. Now, I'm very cognizant that external, validity from 2 counties in Kenya doesn't mean that that's externally valid to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa or developing countries. But I think that's the point, is having a much more careful consideration of what studies are externally valid to where is important. And if we don't design our projects so that they can be externally valid to the large scale or national scale hopes and dreams that we have, we really are doing a disservice to countries and policymakers with the results that we provide them. And I do hope that we can, I just appreciate that there are so many people on this call and interested in this sort of thing and being able to kind of expand and extend the sort of research evidence that we provide to countries. And just in general, I would, as a researcher, this is me only, I would like us, or at least myself, to be a bit more modest to countries about the promises we can make regarding the overall effects of mother tongue instruction. Again, there's a modest amount of research we really have from this part of the world that shows that at large, medium, or large scale, exactly this X will happen or exactly Y will happen. And I do think it's incumbent on us to start producing that evidence and then be able to share it in a way that can help policymakers make better decisions. So I'm really appreciative of how many people came on this call and listened, and I'm looking forward to your comments as we continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ben, very much. We've had a bunch of questions come in through both the chat and Q&A function, so we may not get to all of the questions now, but please do use this as a springboard for future conversations. Ben has his contact details up on the screen right now. As he mentioned, his article based on the presentation he just shared is also in the most recent issue of Comparative Ed Review. So to get to the question, one kind of context is how long was the intervention?
So we ran over that very fast. We started at the end of 2013 and went into 2014. So basically it's a full academic year only.
And then how much mother tongue instruction did the control group receive?
So it's whatever the control group would do. So that ranged from basically none to some. We only were able to assess baseline and endline how much language use they had, and as you saw from those results, it was very, very modest amounts. So I think we can be confidently say that there was very little mother tongue instruction happening in control environments.
Okay, thank you. Another question, can you please define the criteria for deciding what PRIMR is?
So PRIMR was the primary math and reading intervention, and so basically what we did with the government is they chose the counties we went to the counties and asked them which of these zones are predominantly language speakers of this language. So in Bungoma, the Lubukusu part of the study, there was most of the county was predominantly Lubukusu speaking, but there was portions that weren't. So they identified which zones were predominantly Lubukusu speaking and which zones were, and then Machakos is basically the whole county was predominantly Kikamba speaking. And then what you did is you randomly select a zone and then you randomly assign it into either the control, the PRIMR non-mother tongue, or the PRIMR mother tongue treatment group. So you end up with, a pretty well organized and kind of similar language setting across those three treatment groups, with some places that spoke languages very well and some that didn't. I think one interesting thing between the two languages, when we did our survey from kids about what language they speak at home, over 70% of the Lubukusu language areas where the kids said they spoke Lubukusu at home, but that means that 20% plus did not. Which I think is the reality in many countries that are having kind of language complex environments, as opposed to the Kikamba area where it was 90% plus spoke Kikamba at home.
Okay, thank you. Why should we expect improvement if the materials and evaluation instruments are not in mother tongue?
So the evaluation instruments were in mother tongue in the local language, particularly language assessment. So there was all the control, mother tongue and non-mother tongue intervention had a local language assessment, which was done and piloted and validated by government and language officers. You were asking a very good question with respect to mathematics. I think the assessment in math was not in local language, it was in English.
Oh, okay, then that answers the next question. Did the intervention provide materials and training for math and mother tongue too, or just for mother tongue classes?
I think that's an important thing for everyone to be clear about, is that this was helping teachers use mother tongue as a language when in the predominant context across most of sub-Saharan Africa, even when these language policies have been in place, there haven't been local language materials. And so it's a pretty big step to be able to develop materials in English, science and mathematics and social studies that are in mother tongue. I think there aren't many countries that have been able to do that, even much wealthier countries than the part of Africa that I know well, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So the design was trying to help them utilize mother tongue in the English subject, and the materials that they had there were in English speaking. So a different design would have been to actually develop materials in local language for these other subject areas, but that would have invalidated the idea of trying to implement this project in a way that would have been more affordable by the country. But I do encourage those of you or whoever's asking that question that is a perfectly valid thing to test and be able to see the cost of. What does it look like at kind of a similar scale, if not larger, to be able to develop materials for science and social studies and math and teach them in mother tongue and see whether or not there's additional effects in those subjects that are assessed in mother tongue. That is a different design than we tried, but I think something that's worth studying, but to be fair, hasn't been done in many countries, and number one, and number two, hasn't been studied in many countries.
Well, and then related to your response to that question, are the teaching materials used available to see?
Yes. We've had them up on the EdData website for a couple of years. That website is now transitioned, so if anybody wants to answer that question, I think there's now a new website that they've found their way to. You can just ask me directly.
Well, and that's also related to an update, is that you can access EdData documents and resources on GRN. We're in process of making that migration. Another question, do you think the benefit of improved mother tongue mastery might be a lagging benefit for L2, L3 languages requiring a longer-term study?
I think definitely there's a greater likelihood that the effects of learning in mother tongue would have been felt over a longer period of time. And ideally, we would have had 2-3 years to assess this. I think what's unique and interesting and worth noting about this study is that there is this negative effect at the beginning. What would have happened over time, whether that would have discouraged communities to be able to stick it out, or if the additional impact would have come in a lag time period, we just don't know, and I hope we can have studies will be able to assess that more directly.
Another question from one of our attendees, how is the data stating increase, decrease in use of mother tongue collected? Lesson observations or interviews?
So this is direct lesson observation. The assessor was given a tool that took 3-minute interval snapshots of language use. So at the 3-minute interval, the assessor, using a kind of a pretty structured modified styling snapshot, would look at what language the teacher was using, what language the student was using, and what language the materials that were in use were in. So across this study, which was several hundred classrooms were observed. I think the number I remember is 11,000 plus classroom snapshots. So we have a pretty robust amount of information on the language use. One of the things we didn't present here is kind of, we asked questions of the teachers of whether or not they thought there should be more or less mother tongue language use, and I think the typical response was less, which we were kind of disappointed to see even after the intervention.
We have 2 questions that have come in that are very similar around what languages were used when assessing students in English, Kiswahili, and math. Another attendee is asking, shouldn't we also explore an experiment where the materials and evaluation instruments are written in mother tongue? Otherwise, it seems that the study is marred by a major compound, the use of non-mother tongue materials in measuring the effect of mother tongue verbal use.
So the English assessment was in English, Kiswahili assessment was in Kiswahili. In both of those studies, if the child didn't understand the instructions, they could be explained to it in another language. The math assessment had both languages available, so that if the child didn't understand the instructions and then understood mother tongue better than English, we would ask them in mother tongue. So we were trying to make the math assessment not language specific, but skill specific. That's hard to do, and it's hard for the assessor to kind of accurately identify what language would be most appropriate, but that's something we really did try in this round of the assessments to make it not confounded by language, but there's definitely more research needed on whether it's better to just do that assessment in mother tongue versus have it like we thought about it, which was to try and make it a math assessment not related to language, so that in many parts of the world, kids are more likely and teachers are more likely to know the words of these mathematics terms in English or another language rather than L1. I remember in this training we were trying to get a standardized view of what the right word for the shapes were for triangle and square and circle. And that wasn't very easy for people who were speaking similar languages. They didn't have the same terms for that, but everybody knew what a triangle was. So in that context, even when you're teaching in mother tongue, what word would you use to test whether or not a kid knew the 3-sided thing? If you asked them the term in mother tongue that they didn't know because it wasn't as broadly shared, they might not do as well as when you asked the question in mother tongue but gave the term in English. So, this is for all the geniuses on the call to figure out how to do, but I think it's a really good question.
Taking a bit of a turn, you talked about the 2-day teacher training in mother tongue. What was the curriculum for mother tongue teacher training like? Or is that available for participants to access?
Design of the training was, we had 10 days was over the year, so it was basically a 4-day, 3-day, 2-day for term 1, term 2, and term 3. I know different countries have different structures to the years. In Kenya, you have 3 terms, so we got several days at the beginning of the year, and then that declined for term 2 and term 3. So at the end of each of the trainings, for a day at the beginning and first term, the day at the second and second term, and half a day or a little, some combination of 2 days, and third term, you were able to support them on how to use the mother tongue language materials and talk to them about how they would utilize local language, the benefits of local language from research. Again, we were, using the literature that we all know that's, using kind of small-scale studies from developing countries and large ones from elsewhere, but trying to encourage them on the use of the language and also encourage them on how to understand and how to utilize the mother tongue materials when some of the teachers themselves weren't mother tongue trained.
Great, thank you. Was fidelity of implementation tracked?
We had a pretty large amount of classroom observational data that came from the TAC tutors. These are the instructional supervisors, and they were able to see teachers and help teachers and give feedback to teachers. So we have quite a lot of data on it. I think what we found is that, again, that TAC tutors kind of self-selected away from mother tongue, and similarly teachers self-selected away from mother tongue, so that if a TAC tutor was visiting the classroom an average one would be less likely to observe a mother tongue teacher. And we had many anecdotal reports where teachers would be happy being observed in the other subjects. Well, Kiswahili was also seen as tougher, but didn't want to be observed in mother tongue. That said, we had quite a few classroom observation data from the mother tongue project. As far as whether it's fidelity of implementation from a kind of formal sense, we didn't have a tool to do that. But I do think we're pretty pleasantly surprised, given some of the concerns we had about how much resistance there was in Kenya to mother tongue, that we did have as much implementation of the project as we did. And I think one key lesson learned was in no small part because it wasn't an either or. I think a different design would have been either the mother tongue stuff or not, and then you would maybe see a bit more resistance, at least in Kenya, or at least in these environments. But I did think we saw a bit heavier implementation on the mother tongue classroom side than we initially thought. But at the same time, we probably had less time spent in the mathematics classroom using mother tongue than we initially thought.
And I think we have two more questions. It's related to your response that will tie up this webinar nicely. The first, how much effort, in your opinion, how much effort needs to be put into mother tongue advocacy, particularly to parents?
I think in a context like Kenya, where there has been a policy in place for a long time that has been heavily resisted, and in fact, there was a white paper that came out in 2013 that kind of restated the mother tongue policy, and there's a lot of uproar from the community. I don't think it's advocacy. I think it's evidence. I think parents in Kenya are smart consumers. They are rational economic agents that if we can show them evidence that the actual engagement in mother tongue will give them the things that they want, not just what we want, which is, the kid being able to do well in all these other subjects as well as mother tongue. If we have the projects with that evidence, we would have to do less advocacy. In fact, my own personal opinion, I think I've really changed on this point, is that advocacy is not the right way to go from my point of view. I think we need to be able to ourselves be sure that at medium to large scale these things can really work. And if we have the evidence of that, we share the evidence. I think I've been impressed by the Kenyan population where the program that's being nationally scaled up right now is implemented and is widely popular. And it's largely because they see that it works and they've been convinced themselves. So I think when and if we have programs that can work at large scale, I think the evidence from those programs will speak for themselves rather than us kind of doing formal advocacy. And I think myself 5 years ago would have said something different to that same question.
Well, related to consumption of evidence, this will be our final question. How is the government of Kenya responding to the results of this study?
So what's happened, the government decided to scale up the non-mother tongue program. So there's actually now a program called Tusome, which is in every public primary school, which is using English and Kiswahili. But there's discussions right now at the curriculum body in the revised curriculum, to expand and reinvigorate the policy on mother tongue again, particularly language learning in mother tongue. So, and they're using this study and these same slides you've looked at as part of the evidence to make that part of the revised curriculum. So it is an open question, and I think I'm interested to see. I actually don't know exactly how it will turn out, and I think I'm really appreciative of the Kenyan government for making decisions to base policy on evidence. I think it's to their credit.
Ben, thank you for your time and your expertise sharing the results of this study. Thank you, participants, for your questions. Reach out directly to Ben if we weren't able to get to your question. Thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.